In other words, one proves one's spiritual transcendence by one's willingness to give your body over wholly to the dominant powers. And so the principle of disengagement at work in modern education isn't just a lack of immersion in learning. It is about half-hearted exploration coupled with wholehearted sacrifice of your well-being to institutional violence. Hughes urges academic laborers to think carefully and honestly about how we are trained to submit to such institutional violence and treat that disempowerment that results as a form of beautiful transcendence. Furthermore, this disempowerment further empowers the regularizing tendencies of the institution. We are not talking about black poetry here. We are talking about the incentives offered to compromise black poetry and the viable alternative spaces it creates for those looking for an intellectual home. More to the point, Hughes' poem, with its emphasis on lofty books that are oblivious to hungers and wars and the evils about us, presses upon the knot of desire in which we enjoy a loss of power in exchange for professional accomplishment. Of course, in recent years, such incentives have decreased dramatically, along with the enjoyment that comes with giving up one's power for the status quo. Such diminished returns shed light on the threatened class status of academic labor, and how accustomed many of us have become to giving up our power for economic gains. In other words, Hughes is critiquing our willingness to undergo disempowerment and then treat that as a virtue that others should learn. And Hughes provides concrete examples of academic laborers spreading such disempowerment in his report, College from the Colleges, which he published in the Crisis magazine in 1934 after a 9-month college lecture tour. Hughes asserts that, quote, many of our educational institutions apparently are not trying to make men and women of their students at all. They're doing their best to produce spineless Uncle Toms, uninformed and full of mental and moral evasions. Hughes then reports on 2 double tragedies of color in one day at Hampton Institute, and I'm quoting him here. One, a distinguished and widely traveled young woman who died in a car accident because local hospitals refused to treat her, and an athletic coach at Alabama A&M who was beaten to death by a mob in Birmingham on his way to see his own team play. Unfortunately, the faculty do not help the students cope or assert themselves in response to these tragedies. Instead, the faculty teach the students what Hughes calls docile dignity. Major Brown, Hampton's faculty president, intercepts several students organizing a rally. Brown says his institution does not, quote, like the word protest and prefers the students move slowly and quietly and with dignity. Hughes realizes that Brown is basically threatening the students with expulsion and loss of credit if they protest. Hughes laments that, quote, the brave and manly spirit of Hampton students who wanted to organize the protest was crushed by the official voice of the institution. These double tragedies and the official response in Hughes' report complicate the popular distinctions between the college or university and the real world, seeing that in some cases the college is more perilous than the world of which it is absolutely a part. Even that is too thin a description of the situation, though. It is commonplace that the college or university declares a diversity initiative only to work against the efforts of academic laborers carrying out that mission, and it feels like one is walking or hitting your head against a brick wall. And that metaphor is drawn from a book by Sarah Ahmed called On Being Included, Race and Diversity in Institutional Life. But even this is too quaint a depiction. Quite often, painfully often, the college or university functions as a state of exception. Hughes' report only hints at the many ways students are crushed by the official voice of the institution. And here I'm referring to something more than the structural limitations to access influenced by a student's racial background, family income, or other factors. I'm speaking of much more aggressive acts. So in a lot of discussions of social media, discussions, there's a lot of focus on a term like microaggressions. But I don't want us to forget about the fucking macroaggressions. Okay? It's still macro, it's not all micro anymore today. I'm speaking of much more aggressive acts, of the racist attacks, sexual assaults, harassment, and intimidation tactics that make campuses uninhabitable for some students who are forced to share dormitories, classrooms, or study spaces with their assailants, of the lack of accountability for students who violently attack their peers and are safer doing so on college campuses because there they risk suspension, maybe even expulsion, but not arrest or criminal prosecution. Of the criminalization of protests that limits the ways that students can speak out about how they or their peers are mistreated or abused. Of young bigots who share the hatred that lack the gall of their ancestors, and so use satire as a guise for their racism. And, you know, in Northern Cal, there was a young black man who was literally being tortured by Confederate students, and was, I mean, it was a brutal situation. And one student contributing to the newspaper or to responding to reporters literally said, well, I thought those guys were playing. I thought it was dark satire. And so when I say hiding behind satire here, like, it's totally serious. I mean, we now need a very different analysis of satire, which Henry Louis Gates signifying monkey, that book comes out of the discussion of satire. But his approach to thinking of satire and race is absolutely inadequate to thinking about how satire and comedy have now become a vehicle through which racism can be excused, even facilitated, right? Even augmented. Okay. And then lastly, a faculty whose individualist careerism has distracted them from their students' sufferings and cede the campus grounds to bureaucracies based on a culture of intimidation, and of students, faculty, and administrators who have been threatened or punished for challenging these patterns. This somewhat thicker description suggests that American miseducation is underwritten by violence, partially veiled in hospitality. In this hospitality structure, European man remains the core of the institution. And that's a very key phrase. A guy named Edmund Husserl wrote an essay called "The Crisis of European Man." Right? Ironically, he was a Jewish man during the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, who was constantly being ostracized and segregated, and literally was still like, well, we got to save European men. Right? So he has a very important speech you can find online that I draw that term from. The students, faculty, administrators, and alumni who can associate most closely with this image are at home, with this image of European man, are at home, while their counterparts who cannot do so, increase the school's diversity but remain guests who must forever show gratitude for being let into spaces they did not supposedly earn. Admittedly, I've combined a complex array of violences, institutional practices, and perspectives together that deserve detailed analyses separately. Nevertheless, my narrative here contrasts Hughes' report on student responses to off-campus violence with the increasing on-campus violence sparking much of today's student activism and institutional transformation. The violence and lack of accountability is meant to ensure that students will deny their own analyses of the situation, deny their physical, emotional, and mental pain, remain vulnerable to those who have and will continue to attack them, choose acquiescence over self-assertion, and then treat it as a moral sacrifice for the good of others or for the institution. Count these among the hallmarks of the docile dignity and beautiful transcendence that Hughes associates with believing that one's spirit can triumph while denying one's flesh. To accept these terms means making the principle of disengagement inevitable. And so now I want to talk about the new day. If we approach this situation with the Du Boisian second sight and all its surrealist implications, we realize that an inversion of our viewpoint opens up a different view. If we return to Hughes' poem, we can see at one point in the poem that there's an and it's right here. Right, come forth, and you see that break, that's a surah right there, so it switches. That's the point I'm getting at. There is an and that sits at the end of a stanza. By doing so, the next sentence, speak about the revolution, shifts from being an accusation against academic reactionaries into a mandate to take up a more radical agenda. In this revolution, as Hughes envisions it, the flesh triumphs as well as the spirit, and the hungry belly eats, and there are no best people, and the poor are mighty and no longer poor. This is not about dogma, as Cold War misrepresentations of 1930s writings would have us think. No, this is more akin to Fanon discussing the working poor in Martinique, who take action not because of dogma, but literally because they cannot breathe. Embracing the flesh affirms solidarities based not on victimization, but upon saying that proletarianization could be the basis for transforming our image of thought and its attendant conceptualizations of the human. And I'm drawing that, of course, from Horton Spillers, and then some recent scholarship from Rizvana Bradley, who is doing a book project that is taking up Spillers' ideas of the flesh in contemporary black performance. At this point, rather than vie to transcend our physical pains, our insomnia, skin rashes, recently attained mental tics, headaches, stomach aches, increased blood pressure, sleep talking, all things that students have told me that they are experiencing by being at their institutions, whether it's where I'm at or elsewhere. All of these that are often near direct results of inhabiting the institutions we're in. We should recognize these pains for what they are. Our bodies telling us that we have no fucking choice but to alter our conditions if we are to breathe, if our living can truly affirm life. The flesh's triumph doesn't do away with the spirit, but grants spirit an eminence that Pauline discipline can only condemn. Rather than speak of transcendence here, we are discussing an Orphic dive. In Hughes's poem, Dear Lovely Death, let me go to that. Got that somewhere on here. Dear lovely death that taketh all things under wing, never to kill, only to change into some other thing, this suffering flesh to make it either more or less, but not again the same. Dear lovely death, change is thy other name. In Hughes's poem, Dear Lovely Death, the speaker discusses the suffering flesh and embraces death because change is death's other name. But in another poem called Demand, listen, dear dream of utter aliveness, touching my body of utter death. Tell me, oh quickly, dream of aliveness, the flaming source of your bright breath. Tell me, oh dream of utter aliveness, knowing so well the wind and the sun, where is this light your eyes see forever? And what is this wind you touch when you run? In this other poem, Demand, the speaker notes that the body of utter death is touched by a dream of utter aliveness. Therefore, by continuing to invert our perspective, so we're inverting it, instead of the spirit triumphing over the flesh, instead it's the flesh triumphing with the spirit. And so by inverting the perspective, I'm saying that if we treat our physical pain and traumatizations as the currency for becoming normal, then we remain caught in a petrified form of life, a living death. On the other hand, we can also treat these as a demand to make our dream of utter aliveness a reality. And educational institutions would be a key contested site for this effort. In another 1930s text, Black Reconstruction, we already have an amazing example of such an effort. In Black Reconstruction's 5th chapter, The Coming of the Lord. There we go, first edition. Alright, so it's right here. Sorry it's hard to read, but I'm going to read it now. In Black Reconstruction's 5th chapter, The Coming of the Lord, Du Bois discusses the ecstatic character of the Emancipation Proclamation's impact on the freed persons. And he says right here, they were consumed with desire for schools. The uprising of the black man and the pouring of himself into organized effort for education in those years between 1861 and 1871 was one of the marvelous occurrences of the modern world, almost without parallel in the history of civilization. The movement that was started was irresistible. It planted the free common school in part of the nation and in a part of the world where it had never been known and had never been recognized before. Free then with a desire for land and a frenzy for schools, the Negro lurched into the new day. The new day is not the sudden desire to learn among black folks. It is the process of reconfiguring mainstream institutions so they can support the dark proletariat's underground learning practices that had always been there, surviving every punishment, misrecognition, insult, and distortion. One must understand what makes it a frenzy then, and why its institution building is performatively described as a lurching movement. And so in what follows, I don't provide an exact model of what institutions should be built. Instead, I want to clarify the ways of seeing, relating, and emoting that are essential elements of whatever effective institution building we may accomplish in the ongoing emendation of black intellect. And of the face of our fathers from souls of black folk, Du Bois makes frenzy central to black communal life. Frenzy varies from, and I'm quoting Du Bois here, silent rap countenance or the low murmur and moan to the mad abundance of physical fervor. The stamping, shrieking and shouting, the rushing to and fro and wild waving of arms, the weeping and laughing, the vision and the trance. And I asked my students who are in my current 19th century African American writing class, I directly asked them, like, how many people they know at Occidental come with this sort of fervor to learn, right? Or if they have it freshman year, do they still have it by sophomore year, right? But we could ask that anyway, right? So the point here, part of the point here is I'm saying, like, instead of looking at 19th century or even earlier moments as in an educational pattern or process that is leading to what we have now, to our ways of education, as if somehow we're the culmination, we need to totally just scrap that idea. In many cases, actually, the bar is high. They set the bar higher than we do now. All right, for freed persons to say, I was just a slave and now I'm going to go to school and I'm going to be able to read the Bible and do this and do that. Like, our goals pale in comparison to theirs. We are not the standard that they try to achieve. They are the standard that we still have to learn from. Okay. Du Bois associates such performances with the tragic soul life. Du Bois says, many generations of black folk firmly believe that without this visible manifestation of the God, the frenzy that is, without that, there could be no true communion with the invisible. And by associating education with frenzy, Du Bois characterizes the new day in terms of radical fascination, sharing, and movement. Frenzy runs counter to Aristotle's principle of disengagement. Frenzy for schools amongst the free persons calls up instances of fascination that displace passive spectatorship. And Gerald Bruns, the modernist literary scholar I mentioned earlier, turns to Gadamer to describe how spectatorship becomes fascination. And I believe this helps clarify what fascination, the type of fascination that Du Bois is talking about. Gadamer says the true being of the spectator cannot be adequately understood in terms of subjectivity. But this does not mean that the nature of the spectator can't be described in terms of being present at something. Being present has the character of being outside oneself. In fact, being outside of oneself is the positive possibility of being wholly with something else. This kind of being present is a self-forgetfulness. Here, self-forgetfulness is anything but a privative condition. It's not a loss, for it arises from devoting one's full attention to the matter at hand. And this is the spectator's own positive accomplishment. You know what I'm saying? At that point, it's not even spectatorship, it's fascination. Catherine Dunham should also be brought into this conversation on fascination based on her writings from the 1930s. Catherine Dunham associates fascination with, quote, active wondering about the invisible and a release from emotional conflict through a complete externalization of one's ego and that of the essence or being with whom the communion is desired. Those are from her anthropological notes on Haiti. She adds, the movement of the envoût is fluid, involving spine based on the head, chest, solar plexus, and pelvic girdle. The effect is complete relaxation. The dance is decidedly soothing rather than exciting, and one is left in a state of complete receptivity. It is in this state that contact with the lowest, with the spirits and the ancestors, most often occurs. My point is threefold. Du Bois and Dunham share Gadamer's interest in spectators achieving fascination. But Du Bois and Dunham go farther by emphasizing that the positive possibility of being wholly with something else results from a shared bodily comportment rather than individualist autonomy. Disrupt this comportment and one cannot maximize the generativity found in giving oneself over to fascination. And then the goal for Du Bois, Dunham, and the communities they study is to find the affective and bodily comportments that provide a basis for sustained receptivity to learning. A receptivity that folds into its supposed opposite, which is production, knowledge production. Consequently, we are invited to reevaluate what counts as productive or unproductive in the pursuit of knowledge. Hughes, Du Bois, and Dunham each go beyond Bruns's understanding of the short-lived nature of poetic community. The free persons introduce a frenzy for schools to a part of the nation and in a part of the world where it had never been, and had never been recognized before. A necessarily short-lived excitement for education would have done nothing to budge the white majority in the South, comprised of rich and poor people who both agreed that education was an elite luxury. Miseducation has worked so feverishly on an institutional level since the 1870s, because of the 1860s, because of the long-term potential impact of the new day, which is not a single instance but a future that is continuously coming towards us. Lurching describes the performative character of this educational movement. The Oxford English Dictionary defines lurch as to lean suddenly over to one side like a ship, or to move suddenly, unsteadily, and without a purpose in any direction, like a person staggering. Dunham's incisive comments on the relation between the industrial era and the body provide some clarification for us. She says, look in the most highly industrialized metropolitan centers and find a pattern fairly generally followed during the past century of rapidly changing mores, ethics, economics, and credos. The rhythm of the average metropolitan center is not one to induce integration. And all we got to do is drive on LA highways to see that, right? Quite the contrary. Our pace is uneven, our boasting has lost the composure of its stature, and our spirit has no oneness with the air we breathe. We are dominated by a cross-current of rhythms and motions emanating from countless man-created machines and institutions, from fears, anxieties, and loss of faith. The rhythm of the human body itself, the beating of the heart, the motion of breathing, The delicate system of waves emanating from the brain centers, the flow of the bloodstream, and the unconscious urging of the muscles are in constant competition with the cacophony and disharmony which are the fruits of the industrial age. I'm sure it's not difficult to see how this extends to our present. Lurching then describes the complex temporalities of industrialization from the 1800s to the 1930s when she wrote that statement, and for me, continues into the era of No Child Left Behind, or however else you want to characterize our present. And although the terms for characterizing the present may be up for debate, Dunham's overall point remains true, that the lurching nature of black institution building is in part responding to the frenetic temporalities of mainstream American life. But lurching is not all a result of external forces, but also a rhythmic attitude characterized by a vigorous style alive with rhythms stuck through and through with bursting life in order to liberate culture from a part of itself already containing the seeds of decay. And I'm combining two quotes, one from Black Skin, White Mask, and one from Wretched of the Earth from Phenomenal. Lurching retains a sense of worklessness in industrial education that, as I've argued elsewhere, is crucial to looking for what is beyond mere utility. In other words, there is a purposelessness to learning because complete engagement means the risk of going in unexpected directions, altering one's goals, seizing the window of opportunity, not knowing where one's insights will go. In other words, there is a receptivity in ecstasy, but receptivity does not equate to inactivity and disengagement. It refers to an opening, a courage to face transformation in all of its complexity. The lurching, impassioned movement of founding troubles the saintly grandeur of acquiescence. With these conceptualizations of frenzy and lurching in mind, I want to close by looking at three passages from Black Reconstruction. Let's see if I have them. They're out of order, but here it is. So, if you can read, if you have like amazing eyesight, it's like right around here. Okay. Two of these examples, two of these instances here exemplify Hughes's proposal that true education occurs when the flesh triumphs along with the spirit. And the third reminds us of the opposition that black folks face, that their institution, because their institution went against several currents in their day. And their commitment to doing this is what makes their work black poetry and a form of study. The first instance comes from Savannah, Georgia. The colored citizens of Savannah were greatly encouraged and assisted in their efforts to start schools by the Reverend James Litch, etc., etc., etc. All right? They examined teachers. 10 colored persons were found competent. It was very difficult to find buildings in which to locate the schools. The most available place was the old blind slave mart, which had recently served as the pen from which relatives of many of these Negroes had been sold. The bars which marked the slave stalls were knocked down to make more space for seating. To this and other places flocked the free people of every age and shade, eager for that book learning which really seemed to them the key to their advance. Then there's another example. In Arkansas, there was a so-called school system before the war, but the governor in 1860 called it radically defective. Skip a few sentences down. Negroes themselves, after 1865, established the first free schools in Arkansas. This they did at Little Rock, where after paying tuition for a short time, they formed themselves into an educational association, paid by subscription the salaries of teachers, and made the schools free. And if I remember correctly, multiracial at that. Okay? And then the third reactive instance. I think I have it. Actually, I do not have that one. But that's okay. It's the first paragraph of the founding the public school chapter. And in there, a Louisiana representative is at a school, majority black students. He sees all these students running around playing, because they're young, right? And he says, what is this? Is this a school? And someone replies, yes. He says, well, for niggas. And he replies, yes. And he says, well, I thought I'd seen it all, but this is the climax of absurdities. Right? That's what he said. All right. The first two examples. Actually, let me quote it here. He says he threw up his hands. Well, I've seen many an absurdity in my lifetime, but this is the climax. That's his quote. All right. The first two examples illustrate a second sight of a most marvelous kind. If by marvelous we mean where fantasy touches on reality, with the confrontation between freedom dreams and the real. That is that which doesn't fit into our typical frameworks of viewing the world, shatters the social order to be made over again. Bryan slave mart stopped operating in December 1864 when Savannah surrendered to the Union. Only through second sight could Savannah's free persons see the iron bars, blood, and tear-stained floors of the old slave mart and turn it into a school for their betterment just a month later. And this, you guys see what I'm saying there? Like, that's really what Du Bois is talking about with second sight. How could you see some shit that is meant to oppress you and you're like, damn, that's my new school? You see what I'm saying? Like, I mean, that's why I say, like, the bar is so much higher. They're setting the bar for us. It ain't the other way around. But at any rate, in this instance, we can envision the lurching movement that comes with transforming the slave market into a school. The thrill of knocking down the bars that pinned in their loved ones. The sudden pauses from the anger and pain of knowing that some losses will never be resolved. The pride pushing them to move again, knowing they're fulfilling dreams others thought would never happen. The combined shock and affirmation that, yes, they are the agency changing themselves in the nation that needs yet refuses to understand them. The flesh triumphs here because they are reclaiming their achievements and even their losses as something worthy of mourning or being proud of. Valorizing what gets sacrificed, they're valorizing the very things that we sacrifice when we accept docile dignity. The examples from Savannah and Little Rock counter miseducation's dependence on sameness, in which diversity becomes an accessory that can be worn or left on the dresser, based on the occasion, right? So, I see this in several institutions. Barely any black students, Asian students, etc. But somehow they all end up on the campus website, right? They're in all the fucking pictures, right? Somehow, right? But you go on campus on a regular day, where are they? Okay. Du Bois's examples suggest that in the new day, difference precedes sameness. When the school in Savannah was finished, Du Bois says students of every age and shade flocked in order to learn. The hospitality model, in which some students are at home based on their racial, class, or other identity, and others are mere guests, unravels here, because ecstasy turns us inside out to an openness, a newness, and uncanniness that disqualifies anyone from being at home. If by at home we mean a stable identity that needs no further transformation, or a transformation that's already got a narrative predetermining where it's going. Being at home in Black Thought means embracing being no longer an I, as Brunn said of ecstatic poetry. Black Thought urges us to brave the difficulties of being turned inside out, of facing the unknown in oneself as well as others. Perhaps this is why Du Bois closes his chapter on the founding of the public school with a piece of poetry from James Weldon Johnson entitled Unknown Bards, which says, there is a wide, wide wonder in it all, that from degraded rest and servile toil, the fiery spirit of the seer should call these simple children of the sun and soil. O black slave singers, gone, forgot, unfamed, you alone, of all the long line of those who sung, untaught, unknown, and unnamed, have stretched out upward, seeking the divine. These bards, these poets who had a frenzy to learn, aren't unknown simply because the beautiful songs, folk tales, and other work they did can't be attributed to a specific author. Nor is it strictly because of the economic, racial, and gender degradation they have endured. They are unknown partially because this stanza glimpses them in the midst of transformation. Unnameable because, as Catherine Dunham suggests, they have externalized the ego towards the positive possibility of being wholly with something else. All right, so the moment you try to name it, you've already missed it because they've moved on. Okay? This principle includes within it a critique of charismatic leadership that Erica Edwards has explored so powerfully in her recent book. Black Thought leaves no exceptions which can skip the loss of the ego towards a being in common. I would add that Dunham's principle challenges us to go beyond Black Thought, to go beyond a version of Black Thought that thinks blackness is merely an identity, and to see it as an exploration of non-identity, of the breaking and repurposing of categories. In other words, those who claim to be a majority in the college or university must now face the unknown in themselves, abandoning the sense of being at home that makes others students into guests, who feel their place in the school is on loan. Meanwhile, those underrepresented students who participate in such institution building, especially when it succeeds, must remain receptive to this process of transformation. That's not the moment to stop, right? That's more reason to keep going. This means not only externalizing one's own ego, but also relinquishing the work of keeping other people's egos intact. Yeah, we can't do the emotional caretaking for folks who need to get over themselves. They got to. It's it's actually for their liberation and ours. You know what I'm saying? Okay. These are but some of the ways that the ecstasy of black poetry is essential to combating miseducation's long history of disavowing human diversity. To see the intellectual quagmire resulting from this disavowal of difference, one need only read Hannah Arendt. You guys have heard of Hannah Arendt before. You know, you guys read Reflections from Little Rock? Reflections on Little Rock? You should read that. To understand this intellectual quagmire resulting from disavowing difference, one need only read Hannah Arendt's Reflections on Little Rock, where she claims that black students wanting to go to a white school tramples on the rights of the white communities, since the white folks built the school after all. Had she overcame her own anxieties about assimilating into American whiteness, she would have read Reconstruction. She would have read Black Reconstruction, and she would have saw, remember what I just read? She would have seen that actually black folks founded the school system that she says belonged to whites. And so this is a concrete example of the diversity that's there before the sameness. Okay? There's this education line where this is the base on we all have to be white. That's distorting what was already true. It was already diverse from the beginning. Hannah Arendt would have also realized her decision to characterize schools as social spaces where equality is besides the point. I mean, that's a key argument she makes. That she would have realized that actually places her in league with the white supremacists attempting to sabotage Little Rock schools 90 years earlier, because many Arkansas whites did not approve education under the Bureau, the Freedmen's Bureau, because they feared it encouraged social equality. So she's literally, I mean, this brilliant German philosopher who escaped Nazi persecution comes to the United States to become white, and then says the same stuff that Confederates were saying 90 years earlier. To understand the viewpoint that Arendt is assimilating into, one need only think about that third example, the Louisiana representative. The example insults but doesn't disarm, because at least he had the boldness to state his real thesis, that black study to him is an absurdity that can never happen, though it happens right in front of him. The lurching in the New Day partially results from progressive plans for change being weighed down by such naysayers whose mere psychosis is backed by civil society support. Black life has steeled itself against such absurdities through study. And I'm closing here. Study for Stefano Harney and Fred Moten is the beyond of teaching, which is really about not finishing oneself, not passing, not completing. Rendering study in this way reminds us of the true complexity of thought. Here's a quote from Du Bois writing on John Brown. Human purposes grow slowly and in curious ways. Thought by thought they build themselves until in their full panoply, vigor, and definite outline, not even the thinker can tell the exact process of the growing, or say that here was the beginning or there the ending. Nor does this slow growth make the end less wonderful or the motive less praiseworthy. Black study undoes the possibility of origin or telos, leaving us with a process more robust than any single product or goal we can extract from it. Thus, the Aristotelian philosophical tradition, which reduces poetry to spectators in search of catharsis and makes poetry the enemy of thought, becomes merely one tradition among many that, frankly, really doesn't do much for us. The theories of liberation resulting from Aristotelianism, Sartre's, and I have Sartre in mind here, Hegel, there's a bunch of people who follow this line. That approach requires a subject-object dialectic that objectifies the black in order to leave it behind. The object of thought in the Aristotelian tradition is framed in such a way as to justify rushing past the complexities that will catalyze our deepest transformations. Rather than stabilize identity at the expense of its curricular object, black radicalism unsettles the distinction between subject and object, enacting a sense of self that doesn't need to objectify anything else, restoring a different dynamism to thought. Harney's and Moten's definitions of study reiterate Hughes's description of the flesh as triumph when where the best are no longer best. That is to say, black study involves a redefinition of intellectual accomplishment in order to sustain a project of collaboration in an atmosphere rife with competition and backlash. This is a claim for the highest excellence, as Du Bois says, and this is another quote from Black Reconstruction. Okay, I'm in it, I promise. Here we go. So it starts like right here and goes up there. This whole phantasmagoria has been built on the most miserable of human fictions, that in addition to the manifest differences between men, there is a deep, awful, and ineradicable cleft, which condemns most men to eternal degradation. It is a cheap inheritance of the world's infancy, unworthy of grown folk. My rise does not involve your fall. No superiority has interest in inferiority. Humanity is one, and its vast variety is its glory and not its condemnation. Study can glory in humanity's vast variety because true superiority finds little interest in deeming someone else a failure. In Du Bois' estimation, this effort is what preserved the collectivity of black folk in years past. Du Bois says, had it not been for the Negro school and college, the Negro would, to all intents and purposes, have been driven back to slavery. The Negro's economic foothold was too slight in 10 years of turmoil to affect any defense or stability. The Negro's Reconstruction leadership had come from Negroes in the North, and white politicians, capitalists, and philanthropic teachers. The counter-revolution of 1876 drove most of these save-the-teachers away, but already through establishing public schools and private colleges, and by organizing the Negro Church, the Negro had acquired enough leadership and knowledge to thwart the worst designs of the new slave drivers. They avoided the mistake of trying to meet force by force. They bent to the song of beating, lynching, and murder, and kept their souls in spite of public and private insult of every description. They built an inner culture which the world recognizes in spite of the fact that it is still half strangled and half inarticulate. In this passage from Black Reconstruction, Du Bois agrees with the conclusion of Langston Hughes' report. Hughes says that he sees no hope for a new spirit in American education unless the students themselves put it there and strike against mid-Victorian morals and the suppression of free thought and action. Those are the last words of his report. In addition to Du Bois and Hughes sharing the same confidence in students to shift the tides, one must also attend to the role of teachers in Du Bois' passage. All but the teachers abandoned the Reconstruction effort in response to a vicious backlash. Hughes' poem, Letter to the Academy, comes to a similar realization, as I discussed earlier when we talked about that end which turned speak about the revolution into a mandate, right? But if teachers and other academic laborers are to join in this effort, it will be because all of us go beyond mere teaching, mere certifications, and still see ourselves as students in an ongoing, uneven, non-teleological process of transformation, even if we are in a different phase than students currently enrolled in our classes. And so here we are, in another phase of black thought at your institution, at mine, perhaps even around the country and the world. The current economic, racialized, gendered, and other forms of attack on progressive education are absolutely disturbing, and those violences must be protested, and they must also be mourned. But inadvertently, that degradation resituates us for new educational endeavors, turning pain into the frenzy to learn and to rebuild. To, as one of my favorite rappers, Pharoah Monch says, raise the bar so high that the bar is afraid to look down. To foster an inner culture that will sustain us from here to elsewhere, to leave behind docile dignity, to sidestep pseudo-transcendence for ecstasy, to reject the narrowness of belief for the risk and abundance of Black Reconstruction. Most importantly, we must remember that whatever the outcomes may be in the new institution building here and elsewhere, we must hold on to the underground desire for learning and relationship that has enriched, sustained, and enlivened so many unknown Black bards who came before us. Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you so much for your presentation. There's so much, you're still processing it.
Right.
But I'm just thinking about your second project in terms of some of the things that you said today with this project.
The one on hip-hop.
Right, yeah. And it's just thinking more generally about kind of returning embodiment to the disembodied subject. You know, what would some of the prescriptive treatments for continuing to make interventions into disembodiment look like for you? Especially when you said that so many of us are not even present on a lot of these campuses.
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. That's like 3 questions. It's all good. It's all good. Well, let me respond to the part about hip-hop first. All right. In my opinion, hip-hop is actually about reestablishing that ecstasy, that frenzy. Okay? You guys ever seen like footage from an old Public Enemy concert? Like, it's a mosh pit, you know what I'm saying? And Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk, when he talks about the frenzy, he said, he speaks of it as a tragic soul life. And hip-hop is very focused on capturing the tragic. But not the tragic in not in that cathartic sense. We see somebody have a bad situation, shit goes wrong. We all share our view and say, "Oh, so glad we're not in his shoes," and then we've had our catharsis and move on. It's not that sort of tragedy. If we were to think of it in terms of a convergence with Western thought, it would be more like Nietzsche, Twilight of the Idols. Like where Nietzsche literally says, like, the tragic artist is the one who's brave enough to fight whatever comes his way or her way, right? It's that willingness to fake. It's that he says to be fearless in front of the fearful, right? I mean, something that inspires fear. But I think hip hop is very much concerned with that. Very much. Bushwick Bill, my mom's playing tricks on me. That's the creep I be seeing in my sleep. Like, he stood about 6 or 7 feet, and he's a dwarf, right? He's like, I'm gonna fight him anyway. It's about confronting fears. There's a hip hop group out right now, underground group, Gang Green, producer Alchemist and Oh No from out here. They have a song album called Ayahuasca, Vodka and Ayahuasca, and it's this there's a shamanic ritual in the Amazon where people take that. It reopens their brain. It literally reopens the synapses, and they can face their fears. So, like when you name your album like Vodka and Ayahuasca, you're gonna face your fears through this album. So, see, hip hop is all about that kind of confrontation, that courage. And to me, that totally lines up with what Langston Hughes is saying, what Du Bois is saying, what so many 1930s black writers are saying. The radicalness was in the event with the capital E is breaking with the fear. See what I'm saying? I'll think about some of the other parts you mentioned about the stuff on campus as other people ask questions. I will come back to that.
You're obviously at a smaller school, not Occidental. I went to Pomona College myself, so very different from now being a staff member here at UCLA. Just the experience, I think, obviously still very limited numbers, but very limited numbers in a small school versus very limited numbers in a large school.
Yeah.
How do you see that playing out, having now trying to wrap your head around what's collective about that struggle, what's very divergent?
You mean collective across those different categories or sizes of institutions?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is important is that, like I said, the kind of main character for this story, for this Thinking Through Crisis narrative I'm comprising is the dark proletariat. Du Bois uses that term in Black Reconstruction, and I ran with it. And but another term that's similar to it is Fanon's idea of the wretched. And what's interesting to me is that in that idea of the proletariat, as well as in the wretched, when you do the kind of etymology, there's this sense of contagiousness. Because ultimately, people pathologize those. Those are the people who get pathologized. The problem is that they're spread. Right? And so what I'm saying is, on the one hand, we do have to build more intricate and consistent networks of communication, right? And thinking about how people can work together, collaborate across these institutions. So part of it is talking to each other, basically. But I think the other part is first and foremost realizing that we are all often bringing some sort of critical perspective, however, nation. And the question is, how can we build on that? So what I'm trying to say is, it's not coincidental. Let's put it like this. 8 years ago when I was in grad school, I could not have predicted that this would be a moment with so much unrest on college and university campuses all over the country. And at first it seemed like, well, there's this problem at this one school or these two schools. But whether it's in terms of gender inequity, racial inequity, whole range of things. Right? Suddenly it's like every school, there's lawsuits, there's protests, there's social media campaigns. Suddenly it just spread. And so what I'm trying to say is, one, the communication's key, and I'm still not sure how to theorize that. That's an open question that I would love for more people to think about with me. But then the other point is, we also need to literally depend upon that contagion, that contagious aspect, which means we have to literally spread our viewpoint, right? Even though it's going to alter shape and form depending on the context. And so, I mean, at this point, the whole I am Harvard thing now, that's at Oxford. They're doing that. So, how did it spread across the Atlantic? What the fuck happened? I mean, but this is also why I think the notion of the ontological totality from Cedric Robinson is so key. He's saying that even despite the distance, or perhaps even because of the distance, there's a shared consciousness. right? Now, how to make that most effective in each space, I mean, that's where it requires a different kind of focus, focus analysis. Yes.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned the Stefano Hardy, Fred Moten piece, Under Commons. By the way, for every single graduate student in this program should read that book. It's free. You can download it.
Absolutely.
It's in the subtitle, Fugitive Planning and Black Studies.
Yes.
It's a brilliant book. So I want to ask you about this whole question of fugitive planning and the undercommons as thinking about alternative institutions. Like so much of what both Langston Hughes and others are talking about are institutions that Black people are building and establishing. But then you get to the stage where there's the movement like Black Studies itself as a modern post-World War II phenomenon, though we know it goes way back. But it's sort of, its manifestations coming out of social movements in the 1960s was about creating institutions that were outside of the university.
Right.
So like Black Studies, they could be not just a department, but a college. In a college that would be housed in community off campus. Or the independent school movement. In other words, what are your thoughts about the capacity of existing institutions to provide or to seize a space for the kind of revolutionary, truly revolutionary education you're talking about? This is what you're talking about, revolutionary. The fact is purposeless is I think, a central part of the issue. So, are these institutions necessary? Is there something possible within these academic institutions?
I mean, part of the reason why I emphasize the underground at the start and at the end, and in the chapter I speak more about the underground part consistently. My first point is that we have to hold on to that underground desire, which looks for openings wherever it finds them. I mean, I'm literally saying that one of the bigger claims in the book project, Thinking Through Crisis, is that the Underground Railroad is not just a historical instance. It is a model, right, of decentralized political fugitive planning. It is the model in the North American context, if not the New World, in my opinion. I mean, but even if you go to Europe, right, who was really fighting against Hitler? It was the underground. It was the underground resistance. So we still haven't done enough to theorize what the complexities of the underground. And so for me, it's a site, it's a site where we could face desires that we would otherwise condemn or minimize. It is also a site where a different sort of planning can happen that, like I said about contagion, can either focus on one space or spread out into several, you see. So, in other words, I want us to have both those institutions that are kind of clearly for us, and in those spaces where we feel like we're in enemy territory, literally because our bodies tell us that. That underground part is still just as essential. That doesn't go away, whether it's Morehouse or UCLA, Oxford, or whatever. You see what I'm saying? So I think we still need that element. We have to hold on to that no matter what. Now, as far as when we're in, I guess what we could call mainstream educational institutions in the United States, I mean, that's why I wanted to say that, it's the contrariness that is so key, right? It's literally, like Fred Moten talks about, blackness is something you claim. It's literally something you claim to inhabit the space in an alternative way. It's always to some extent accidental, but there's a certain point where you have to embrace that rather than give that up to go along with the mainstream in your space. And so then it's a question of looking at the ins and outs, the intricate histories, figuring out who can, just like the Underground Railroad, who says they're on your team but they really aren't, who you need to work with even if they're not on your team to get this done. I mean, those kinds of practicalities then matter in a different way once you figure out, am I in a space that is actually in its mission and its practice more for where I'm trying to go, or am I really running contrary here? You see, so what I'm trying to say is, I don't think the goal is to we should all be at UCLA or all at Oxy or all at Morehouse, even I hope plenty of people keep going to Morehouse. But the point is, in all of these spaces, we have to figure out how this kind of goal can be enacted. But I'm also saying, in terms of the purposelessness, the truth of the matter is, even in a neoliberal context, there's still so much purposelessness to what's done, right? There's still so many institutions that get serious support when they're not doing shit. And so there still is a purposelessness even in that form. It doesn't get labeled as such. It gets hidden. Like, it doesn't get labeled in that way because then they can't criticize other spaces for having no purpose, right? So we have to actually bring that up ourselves. We have to do that. You know, at a town hall meeting on my campus, you know, one student literally just laid out all of the stuff that had been built recently and how much money they heard it cost, and said, how can you tell us you don't have resources for us to, you know, for black studies or for this or that? Like, they literally said, don't tell us that anymore. And so suddenly, oh, well, we don't have the resources for this or that, or what you're doing doesn't have enough of a purpose. And it's like, oh, this does. It defeated that argument. You see what I'm saying? I mean, in a concrete way, there's now debates about getting a chief diversity officer, blacks. Like, there's all these debates that are happening because the students were like, we're not even going to accept that anymore. So, was that helpful?
Oh yeah, always helpful.
Okay, cool.
Can we take one last question? This is the opportunity.
Can I take two? Go ahead.
Okay, I'm still trying to get all of my thoughts together.
That's okay.
And I'm filming you too, so I need you to stop. Yeah, so you said so many things that touched upon some of the work that I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So you talked about, I'm in archives, and so my research has to do with how can we document certain instances in history and certain modes that we've gone through to create a certain history, and how our certain history is lost. I'm looking at black lesbians. Mm-hmm. And so you said that certain histories are not missing because their stories cannot be attributed to an individual author, but because by the time it's named, the people in question have transformed and moved on. Mm-hmm. So I'm just like, so that was like kind of sticking in my head. It's like, okay, like what does this mean for people who are really trying to kind of capture these moments so that, you know, future people can learn from them, you know? So I don't know, I'm trying to process through that and what it means for people in fields who are very much invested in doing that work of capturing those voices. So it's not even a question. I don't know. I'm just trying to think through that.
Well, first off, I would say that you know, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening with Black studies and LGBTQ research around the archive, and so there's some of that material is much, I think, answers some of that question better than me. When I first was going through grad school, my main focus was race and class, and it was once I finished grad school I said I need to beef up my interest in sexuality studies and LGBTQ culture. So in other words, I think that there are people who can address that in a much more intricate way than I.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of, like, as I'm doing this work, I'm not thinking of it only in terms of, you know, these intersections between race and sexuality.
But one site to.
That's one site, but you know, all of these different intersections. It's just, you know, it's like how do we capture these important spaces? You know, how do we capture what's underground, or how do we capture what's on the margins in a way to make it accessible to?
And I see what you're saying. I mean, first off, I think it's what's key about the idea of second sight, and this is why I call it surrealist. Okay. Like, have you guys seen that image of the ambassadors, that painting? There's this European painting called the Ambassadors, where you have these two ambassadors standing there posing or whatever. And if you turn a certain angle, you literally see a skull right in the middle of the image. For real, you see a skull. But if you turn away, you don't see it. You just see kind of a thick line. And so it was it's a study in perspective. And so what I'm saying is, when we think of second sight from Du Bois, we actually can think of it, especially in the 30s, and looking back at that as a touchstone. It's actually the term is anamorphosis, right? You see it one way, turn an angle, something else comes out. And so what I'm saying is, we have to actually approach the archive in that way. But actually, W.B. Du Bois is a great exemplar of that. So when you talk about, like, John Brown, he was literally outlawed because of Jim Crow from even going to some of the archives that have material on John Brown. But it was the way he reread the biographies that were already there, that instead of seeing a madman or a terrorist, he said, actually what makes John Brown so important is his dedication and his actual genuine respect for black life. for blackness as a culture. And he was an ally, but a genuine. But he was rereading what was already there. So part of it is about literally a shift to say it's not so much that we don't have the right materials. In some cases that may be, but in some instances we're not reading it the right way. And that's why the point about study from Moten and Harney is so important. There's no such thing as being done with the text. Right? The whole point is to keep rereading it to find those other nuances. So part of it is what I'm saying is the answer may be a different patience is needed to reread certain materials in a certain way. But I also think this means being more driven to the moments where you actually see that ambiguity in a personage, and actually working with that and saying how is that actually a part of a process without a subject that actually is about more genuine transformation. That's my best goal now. And I saw that was a question.
Yeah. So I guess you began your talk with the discussion of poetics and how people have conceived poetry and its meaning. So I just wanted to hear from you about the significance of poetry to Black radicalism, or like what about the poetic form? What does that offer? Like, does it offer something different? What is unique about poetry?
Yeah, there's a few different answers to that, or a few different angles to answering that question. In a recent essay from David Marriott, who's at UC Santa Cruz, he has this very long essay responding to Sylvia Wynter, and it's called, I forgot the exact title, but at any rate, it's drawing on that passage from Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, where it talks about introducing invention into existence, right? Talking about a leap. And in there, he basically says that a lot of people have overlooked the significance of the psychoanalytic for Frantz Fanon. And he said the reason why psychoanalysis is so important for Fanon is because it actually is able to deal with the nothingness, with the gaps. Rather than take everything and say it must mean that things are going in this direction or another. It can do that, but it can also say like, oh, nothing happened, right? This was a non-event, right? And it can say, okay, that's a loss, but also that doesn't mean it's disarming. On the other hand, everything that is supposedly triumphalist could actually be self-harming. So there's a different flexibility because psychoanalysis doesn't demand the same teleology. And it's not coincidental that he says that, and he's a poet. He has like 5 or 6 books of poetry that are amazing. So what I'm trying to say here is poetry, I think, is very important because poetry can actually deal with the gaps. It can deal with the failed projects and not, like, put failed in scare quotes. Like, it's interesting when the way we talk about Black radicalism, we talk about the project and put that in scare quotes as if that's up for question, but we don't question, is it really failed? And so, yeah, if you talk about the Underground Railroad as a single, one person or 2 people escaping and they get caught, it failed. But the fugitive slave law was not created because it failed. It was created because it was working. You see what I'm saying? So the gaps in the Underground Railroad, the absences, what looks like nothing is there, actually could be something happening. You look at incidents in the life of a slave girl. To me, this is still a poetics in this because if you watch what was happening, if we could go back in time, all these Black folk are acting like they're happy with slavery. Why? Because they're helping one person get away. And that one person can only get away if they all pretend that everything is cool. You see what I'm saying? So it looks like there's nothing there when there's something actually there. Poetry can deal with that complexity, the ambiguity, without resolving it. And so that's part of why I talk so much about the physical. Oh, the other thing is poetry, more than the novel, more than prose, but similar to oratory, actually invites us to be embodied. Sometimes I teach experimental books like Zong, and I ask my students, like, just look at the first page. What does this mean? They say nothing. I say, let's read it. They don't want to read it. I read it aloud. Anyone got ideas? Every hand goes up. The moment someone embodies it, it captures people. And so poetry, you can't be a spectator in poetry. You can't. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you.